Gaggle will challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. It is now 9:13 p.m. And yes, you guessed it, gray, sunless, lightless, dayless Budapest. I haven't seen the sun now for several weeks, and that's a kind of a strange experience. You forget what the sun is like. You forget what it's like when everything isn't just clouded over with drabness and grayness. However, on a more uplifting note, thank you very much, everybody who has joined me today, December the 23rd. So, on the eve of Christmas Eve. And Roby, we're coming now to the end of the year. And at the moment, we're in a kind of a holding pattern because nothing is going to happen until the uh, um, it's a Dale Owens. Good to see you, Dale. And Dale says, "Hi George, it's Christmas, so I have an alcohol-related question." Well, you've come to the right place. How do you think so many writers, artists, actors manage to be productive despite being drunks and alcoholics? I'm thinking of people like Kingsley Amis, Dylan Thomas, Richard Burton, or or do you think they are productive because they drink a lot? That's a very interesting question. It is something that I've given some thought to because, as you know, I mean, and I've talked to Dale privately about this. I knew Kingsley Amis a little bit many years ago, and I was struck then by the prodigious quantities of alcohol that he would consume every evening. I mean, that's some serious drinking that he would do. And then, he would make his way to his bed, slump down, somehow, and then 7 in the morning he would be up, and then he would write 2-3 hours, whatever he was writing. First thing, he would just wake up and do this. And you know, I don't know whether the alcohol made them productive, but I think in his case, and maybe that's also the case for some others. He had acquired a certain kind of personal self-discipline, I think, from his parents, from his upbringing, that you get up and then you work. And I think that whatever, it's a Puritan ethic or whatever. So there's nothing wrong. You can drink and whatever, but you're supposed to work. And so that's, I think, how we did. And I think that's probably true for a number of people, that they despite the enormous quantities of alcohol that they would consume, they still somehow retained some measure of self-discipline and good. Now, there are people who are able to work even though they're in an alcoholic haze, which without question. As I said, that wasn't the case with Amis, because Amis would sleep, wake up, and then begin working. But there are people who, without question, would just work in an alcoholic haze. I mean, Christopher Hitchens would do that. Again, also consume a great deal of alcohol, and then I don't know, he would go home and then start writing. Now, you could argue, and particularly in the case of Hitchens, that the output itself was, a lot of it was just simply almost kind of meaningless verbiage, not really saying anything, just simply talking and talking and talking without coming to the point. I mean, that was something, I think that was the case in his writing. But to a certain extent, that was also the case with Paul Johnson, who also consumed enormous quantities of alcohol and could still write. But he would write, and once you have the formula down, and Johnson, at least in his journalism, had a certain formula, then I think you can just simply work through, your your alcohol-induced verbiage. Um, but I don't know. I've never been able to do that. I think that at either end, I've never been able to work through an alcoholic haze. I've never really trusted myself to say something. Uh, say something that would pass muster, with an editor while in an alcoholic haze. And I've never been particularly good at getting drunk and then waking up after 3 hours and then start writing. So I think different strokes for different folks, but I do think that it's much more of an English thing. I think that the English who with the consumption of alcohol and continue to write. I know that whole drunken writer, the literary figure who's an alcoholic, always getting drunk at a party and whatever, and always inebriated. It's much more of a stock English figure than an American figure. I mean, there are obviously the figures on the American scene who are like that, but it's much more of an English thing of the chronic alcoholic. But it's and it's an interesting thing. I mean, because Amos died. He was 73 years old when he died, and when I heard of his death, I thought that well, he made it to 73. That's a that's quite a that's a decent enough age at which to die. And for someone who had drunk the way he'd done, I mean, in a sense, he'd abused his body the way he had for decades. It's quite impressive. I mean, it's many people die much earlier and don't abuse their bodies the way he did. So I think people are different. But I was reading recently, and I think this was Marty posted Gore Vidal's memories of Orson Welles, and that was Orson Welles' last years, and Gore Vidal wrote there that Welles, he was really during his last years he weighed 400 pounds. That's some serious weight, 400 pounds. And but he lived on to the age of 70. So for years and years he had been grotesquely overweight. And so however unhealthy that was, 70, that's a sort of a reasonable life expectancy. So all the health recommendations and whatnot, they don't really amount to very much. I mean, if you can live at 400 pounds and live to the age of 70, then really, why do we sit, listening to people, the experts on health? Anyway, Dale goes on. Have you ever seen Only Two Can Play? Yes, I have. Based on that uncertain feeling with Peter Sellers. Amos appears briefly getting off a bus in Swansea. Yes, that's right. I didn't particularly. Well, it's ages ago since I saw it. But it's very much of a film of its time. I mean, it's in black and white, and it has a kind of some grimness, but also a certain understated humor. So it's worth watching. I mean, it's like a a piece of post-war English culture. So it's it's interesting to watch. I don't know how it holds up now, but it's yeah, definitely worth watching. And it has Mai Zetterling there, who's the I guess the love interest, the exotic European woman, and this librarian, has an affair with her, and so on. But yeah, so I don't think we're going to feature it in the Gaggle Film Club unless there's a popular demand for it, and it says, yeah, we want to see Only Two Can Play. But Amos kind of had a formula. He kind of worked out a formula, quite a successful formula, very early on in his literary career, and a lot of it really revolved around the changing sexual mores. Sort of basically, one of the most important of the changing sexual mores of his time was that basically nice girls now had sex before they got married, um, and even people who got married would quickly got bored with their marriage, and their eyes would start wander, and try to have some hanky panky outside. Um, but yeah, so that was, it's that was his thing. That was Amos's thing. I mean, it's like that. The very much the changing sexual scene of the 1950s and 60s. Um, there was yeah, God, I was thinking there was another film based on Amos's one of Amos's books. I can't I can't remember the title now, but there were really variations on that formula. Um, Bloke gets married. That's because that's what you're supposed to do. But he's kind of bored. Got young children, bored with his wife, and it starts. Eye starts wandering, and again, suddenly, hey, there are nice girls who are available where they didn't used to be available, and you've even got married women who are available, which also they weren't used to being available. Um, anyway, and Adele says Peter Sellers, goodness me, another unusual character. Yeah, he is an unusual character, but the interesting thing was, I mean, he was a complete nutcase. Sellers, he was an utterly um, kind of unstable character. Also abused drugs and so on. Very difficult. People found it very difficult to uh, deal with, and again, years and years of abuse of drugs, and he kind of created this fantasy, um, which was some found quite irksome, that he and Sophia Loren had had an affair, and he went on and on insisting upon this, even though Loren denied this, that there was ever any affair. They were in a film together, The Millionaires, and he became quite obsessed with her. And uh, but I don't think there was an affair, because I think not only did she always deny that anything had taken place between them, but Sellers' friends also denied that anything had taken. But nonetheless, he went on insisting, which in itself was kind of odd, because you would have thought, I think you should at least be discreet about it, rather than just, because after all she was a married woman at the time. But nonetheless, he just went around saying, "Oh, Sophia Loren and I had an affair," and I guess he wanted to build up his own reputation. It was kind of a nice, well, I wouldn't say nice, but kind of a Jewish boy made good, that he'd managed to bang, the woman the whole world wanted to bang, Sophia Loren. So here was this sort of Jewish kid from the East End. Hey, I snagged Sophia Loren, but I don't think it ever happened. I really don't. I mean, all the evidence is that it never happened. Um, and Adele says, yeah, he claimed that in an interview with Parkinson's. Well, yeah, he did claim that in an interview with Parkinson. And right away, I remember when he did that, and the first thing that strikes you is, well, that's very indiscreet. I mean, you know, it, even if it's true, it's very indiscreet of you to say this about a woman who's married, or that you had had an affair with her. Um, but he was so eager to boast of this, and but that was his thing, and that I think it was, yeah, Jewish boy who's done really well for himself. He's managed to bang Sophia Loren, and you can see, the various sort of women he had. They were all kind of glamorous starlets of that era. The people who would envy him. Well, Brett Eklund. Why he managed to nail Brett Eklund. So he was a very, very gifted person. Obviously, he's a great, very brilliant comedic actor. But I think as a human being, he's I don't know, kind of a rubbishy person. So you can't really think. Yeah, Dale says no gentleman. No, that's right, no gentleman. So that's what I mean. It's just a kind of I don't know, not a person you think very highly of. It's just he's a type. Basically he's a type that one's come across over the years. It's just so. But I know, and you're not someone who you command respect as a person. But obviously prodigiously talented as a comedic actor. And then Dale asked me, "Did you like being there?" Not particularly. I always thought that it was a wildly overrated film, because and none of it ever really seemed believable. That supposedly everyone was taken in by Chauncey Gardner. That, oh, he's really a genius or whatever. I mean, I don't know. It just never seemed believable. It looked like one of these a comedy sketch that was expanded into a full length feature film. I just didn't think it worked. Um, Robert says a group captain Mandrake was not an expression of his innermost self. No, I don't think so. But as I say, I mean, I think he was a very, very talented. I mean, without question, a very, very talented comedic actor. He could get into these parts as great actors can do, but that doesn't mean that he himself was particularly I don't know, particularly commendable person. I think he really wasn't. But he could get into these parts. I mean, he was entirely believable as Group Captain Mandrake, who was the one person in the film who was intelligent and level-headed and reasonable, and almost saved the day. I mean, he didn't quite do it, but almost saved the day. I mean, but everyone else was just, either off their rocker, namely the generals, even Turgidson, or kind of weak and ineffectual, like the president. But Mandrake was one who was the who was the sort of the 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 kind of the moral intellectual ballast of the film. Um, anyway, that was a distraction, but it's in the spirit of Christmas, so we can be distracted. Um, so a couple of things that I wanted to address. First, really a silly story in itself, and it's something we have covered before on the Gaggle, and which is the growing pressure on the Alternative für Deutschland party in Germany, and it's clear that they're laying the groundwork for eventually outlawing the party, and they're obviously laying the groundwork for outlawing the party because ultimately, I think NATO land is preparing for a war with Russia, and of course, the only way you can have a war is by repressing all forms of dissent in your country. And the dissent these days, the most vociferous dissent these days, comes from the populist right. Um, so this here's the story today in Politico, where they're of course concerned, as was who wouldn't be, about the links between the Alternative für Deutschland and Kremlin. And here, Germany's far right AfD accused of gathering information for the Kremlin. So this accusation had been made before, and we talked about it before on the Gaggle. But the fact that they're bringing it up again, it just shows that this is something that's that really they mean this seriously. This is how they're going to get around the constitutional prohibitions in Germany on abolishing a political party. I mean, they tried the Nazi, Hitler, fascist, threat to democracy route. That hasn't really succeeded so far. I mean, Germany did outlaw some political parties, but then the courts kind of stepped in and say you can't really outlaw them, because the constitution forbids it. But those parties were much smaller, and so they could more or less outlaw them without necessarily anyone particularly worried about it. But the AfD is now the most popular party in Germany. So how do you deal with this problem? Well, of course, you deal with it by saying that they're essentially working for the Kremlin. And of course, if you are fighting a war against the Kremlin, then you have to deal with this party. You have to outlaw the party. So here's the story. Far-right German politician Ringo Mühlmann has taken a noteworthy interest in exposing information his political opponents say could be of great interest to Russian intelligence. Using the rights afforded to him as a lawmaker for the AfD in the parliament of the East German state of Thuringia, where the AfD is the strongest party, Mühlmann has repeatedly asked the regional government to disclose intricate details on subjects such as local drone defenses and Western arms transports to Ukraine. So right away, you notice what's happening here. They're delegitimizing, asking legitimate questions about what the German government is up to, and particularly on the matter of Ukraine, where asking about local drone defenses, and then they're asking about arms shipments to Ukraine. So it says, what information does the state government have about the extent of military transit transports through Thuringia since 2022, broken down by year, type of transport, number of transits, and known stops? Mühlmann asked in writing in September. And then, so why is there anything unusual? Why is that anything that Politico should be agitated about? One day in June, Mühlmann, who denies he's doing Russia's bidding, filed 8 inquiries related to drones and the drone defense capabilities of the region's police, who are responsible for detecting and fending off drones deemed a spy threat. Now, you would have thought these are reasonable questions given the drone hysteria. I mean, the German government has been in the forefront of the drone hysteria, that somehow Germany is under attack by drones that originate from Russia. And therefore, any politician would be remiss in not asking some questions about these drone sightings, because after all, the the German government is kind of using these drone attacks to build up support for an eventual war with Russia, because Germany claims that it is under attack by Russia. Therefore, Germany needs to undertake a massive rearmament, and Germany needs to go into debt to finance this rearmament. And the key part of the German government's claim is that Russia is attacking Germany through these drones. So it says, what technical systems for drone defense are known to the Thuringian police, and to what extent have these been tested for their usability in law enforcement? Um, okay, all very pertinent question, and particularly the issue of law enforcement. Is this going to be something that's going to be used against German citizens? Such questions from AfD lawmakers on the state and federal parliaments have led German centrists to accuse the far right party's lawmakers of using their seats to try to expose sensitive information that Moscow could use in its war on Ukraine and to help carry out its so called hybrid war against Europe. So notice what they've done here. They said, oh, these are not legitimate questions that you're asking. These are questions that are helping the Kremlin. That's the goal of the AfD, to elicit information that will be of use to the Kremlin. One cannot help but get the impression that the AfD is working through a list of tasks assigned to it by Kremlin with its inquiries, says the Thuringian Interior Minister Georg Mayer. So he says one cannot help but get the impression that the AfD is working through a list. So what does that mean? You cannot help but get the impression. Is that what you think the AfD is doing? But he said one cannot help but get the impression. This is the Interior Minister. So this is the guy who's in charge of the police, local police. So this article goes on. What struck me, this is Maya still talking, what struck me was an incredible interest in critical infrastructure and the security authorities here in Thuringia, especially how they deal with hybrid threats. Maya told Politico, suddenly geopolitical issues are playing a role in their questions, while we in the Thuringian state parliaments are not responsible for foreign policy or defense policy. Well, then what's the problem? Why are you getting so agitated if they're asking these questions? If you don't have anything to do with any of that, then why are you so upset? But of course, you do have something to do with that, because this is all part of this whole claim of that you're under attack by Russian drones. So of course, this matters very much to Thuringia, because it's Thuringia who's supposedly defending Germany from this drone attack. And then AfD leaders frequently take positions favorable to the Kremlin. That basically means they're not in favor of preparing for war with Russia, favoring a renewal of economic ties and gas imports, and the cease of weapons aid for Ukraine. Their political opponents, however, have frequently accused them of acting not from conviction alone, but at the behest of Moscow. Of course, that's exactly what they've done. Green lawmaker Irene Mihalich, for instance, last month called the party Russian President Vladimir Putin's Trojan horse in Germany. So this is the Greens are obviously they're the worst. They're the worst people in Europe. And it goes on. AfD politicians deny allegations they are using their rising parliamentary power, both nationally and in Germany states, to try to pass on sensitive information to the Kremlin. Tino Kruppala, one of the AfD's national leaders, strongly pushed back against the allegations his party is attempting to reveal arms supply routes to benefit the Kremlin. Citizens have legitimate fears about what they see and experience on the highways every evening, he said in a talk show last month when asked about Mühlmann's inquiries. These are all legitimate questions from a member of parliament who is concerned and who takes the concerns and needs of citizens seriously. You are making insinuations, which is quite perfidious. You are accusing us of things that you can never prove. So this is kind of very important that these legitimate questions asked by a democratically elected politician, and particularly when the issue is Germany's preparations for war, because that's really what we're talking about here. But no one, no, you can't do that. If you discuss that, then obviously you are working for the Kremlin. And as I say, I think ultimately what they're trying to do here is, prepare the public for this war. And I do think that ultimately is how Europe is thinking. I mean, Europe is um, they're working on a strategy. I mean, I know we always have a good laugh, Kaya Kallas and von der Leyen and so on, but they have a strategy, which is to stretch out this war for as long as possible, trying to find different ways that they can finance um, the war effort, and in the meantime, to weaken Russia to the point when I think Europe can get into the war. I mean, the date that they've assigned, which is 2030, by 2030, they feel Russia will have been fighting for 8 years. It would have lost already an enormous number of people. It would be exhausted. And that's the moment when Europe, I think, is planning to get directly involved with the United States. Obviously, that's the key. So all they have to do really is to keep the war going, see Trump out. I think that's and that I think is doable. I mean, you really are getting the sense that we're in the kind of the fade out of Trump. I mean, already the jockeying um, for the succession has begun. We talked about it yesterday. Ted Cruz is planning to throw his hat in the ring, and then of course we've got the Turning Point people who are now endorsing um, J.D. Vance, and then of course you're having the quite ferocious attacks on J.D. Vance emanating from the Israel First crowd. I mean, they're absolutely targeting J.D. Vance. So this battle is now joined. So already we're kind of moving into the into the post-Trump era. So that's what the Europeans. The Europeans, let's keep this war going. Try to see if we can finance this somehow or other. After the midterms, Trump will be much weakened. Their calculation is a very reasonable calculation that the Democrats will retake the House. It's not a huge a burden for the Democrats to win back the House. I mean, the Republican majority is quite small, so even a quite small swing to the Democrats will be enough for them to capture the House. And then the Democrats can launch their various impeachment inquiries, several impeachments. I mean, I don't think one's not going to do the job. And then Trump would just be bogged down with all of that, and probably will try to work with the Democrats. And the way you're going to work with the Democrats is through Ukraine. Remember, he's the first impeachment, which initiated by the Democrats, was based on uh, uh, Trump's not providing enough aid to Ukraine. That was the basis of that impeachment. So that, obviously, Trump will sense that if I want to keep in with the Democrats to a certain extent, that may not be that effective. But above all, in order to get the Republicans, because he needs, if let's say the Democrats get 50 um, senators elected, 50 senators, they get 50. Every single one of those 50 senators will vote to convict Trump. So that's 50 votes already in the bag to convict Trump. That means the Democrats only need 17 more votes to get to that 67, which will be enough to convict him and remove him from the presidency. And then, of course, to prosecute him. Once he's gone, and he doesn't have any protections. If once he's convicted, removed from the presidency, he doesn't have any immunity from prosecution. So they have to get 17. Now there are an awful lot of senators, Republican senators, who are not at all happy with Trumpism. They're not happy with the nationalist populist agenda. And above all, they're very unhappy with his foreign policy. They're very unhappy with his lackluster support for Ukraine. The Lindsey Grahams. He can't afford to lose any of those people. And so to get Lindsey Graham and there's various other characters, and there are a lot of those people. We never hear about those Republican senators. In fact, we hardly ever hear about any of the Republican senators. We hear about Lindsey Graham, we hear about Rand Paul, not too many others, but a lot of them are absolutely gung ho for Ukraine, and for Trump to rely on them to save him from conviction. He will have to placate them on Ukraine. And that's what the Europeans are counting on. So they're figuring, okay, well, it's now almost January. So they have to just hang out till November. That's just another 10 months. And then after that, Trump will be much more compliant on keeping the war going, on so anyway, Todd 5562 says, I don't see this really like the 17 Republicans would vote to impeach Trump based on Ukraine. I think so. I think they would. And we know that Trump, back in January 2021, was quite concerned about the conviction. Now, admittedly, that was the second impeachment. That wasn't the Ukraine one, but he knew that he would absolutely have to placate the Republicans. And that was really the reason why he didn't pardon Julian Assange. I think he made that clear. That the reason why he didn't pardon Julian Assange was he needed Lindsey Graham. Well, Lindsey Graham would have voted to convict him if he had pardoned Julian Assange. Same with us. So therefore, the Republicans, it would absolutely, tells us J.D. Vance is totally against Ukraine's support, and that's who would be next in line for the presidency. I don't understand that. That doesn't make any. It's nothing to do with anything. First of all, the issue is to weaken the Republican brand, just as the impeachment or the attempted impeachment of Richard Nixon fatally weakened the Republicans. And so, therefore, if Trump is removed from office, then the Republican brand is weakened. very hard to know in what way J.D. Vance thrust into that position, which way he would go. But in any case, even if that's true, even if that's the case, that J.D. Vance would say, "Well, I'm not really interested in Ukraine," with Trump removed, Trump humiliated, it's very unlikely that J.D. Vance would succeed, would win the 2028 presidential election. But either way, the question is what the European calculation is. So the Europeans are calculating as to that there's going to be an impeachment. Trump will have to placate his Republicans. He knows he cannot afford to lose more than 17 Republicans. So there are absolutely 17 Republicans who hate Trump, who care passionately about Ukraine, and will remove him from office. And whoever they get J.D. Vance in, Vance will be a very much a weakened figure, and be very much thinking in terms of 2028. So that's the calculation. Now, the other thing is that Marty is always good to see you, Marty. And Marty introduces himself. Oh my God. Marty introduces himself, as he always does, with a delightful meme. In this case, the president of the UN General Assembly, Annalena Baerbock, looking quite fetching, I have to say. I mean, that's a nice suit that she's wearing. It's a nice white suit. I've never seen her looking quite, looking very, very, very nice. So thank you for that, Marty. Now, the but all right. So that's one aspect of it. The Europeans have this political calculation of they're thinking about the political the election clock in the United States. The other thing that they're thinking of is that and you can see how their minds are working. That they don't think Russia can sustain a war for that length of time. I mean, they have a feeling that Russia can be beaten. That they don't have the manpower, they don't have the resources to continue fighting for that many years. So that's part of the calculations of how do we keep that going. Because I think they feel that they exaggerated, that we'll turn the ruble to ruble, but they feel okay, but if you can keep it going from that 1 year after another year and after another year, at some point they're calculating that Russia will collapse. That's their calculation. I'm not saying that they're right or whatever. That's a different issue. But that's why you have to think about how are they thinking. Then that's what's going on. They've got on one hand, they've got their eyes on the political clock in the United States, and on the other hand, they're also thinking that if you look at Russian history, then they're not that great at fighting protracted wars. That's it. So. So was 16th when Trump impeached and humiliated might help Vance. No, it won't. If the Trump brand is humiliated, then that absolutely reflects negatively on Vance, since it was Trump who promoted Vance and elevated Vance. sell it as them. Vance still fighting the swamp for MAGA. No, no, no. If Trump is beaten and Trump is humiliated, thrown out of office, then that's it. That's the Trump brand that's humiliated. It affects Vance negatively. Just use common sense. It affects Vance negatively. Vance is elevated. Vance becomes, um, the president if Trump prevails and Trump succeeds. Then Vance is the man of the hour. If Trump is not, then he's gone. In the same way that it was Reagan who ended the presidency, in a triumphant way because of the sudden implosion of the USSR, which then you could say, hey, well, that was Reagan's policy. It was Reagan who led to the fall of the Soviet Union, and of course that brought in George H.W. Bush, who would never have won the presidency otherwise. And so because he was Reagan's VP, and Bush, whom nobody particularly liked. This was 1988. Bush won a huge victory. It was a landslide. What Bush won in 1988 because he was Reagan's man. And so that's why. Now the thing here is that someone says here that Ukraine would have to draft every military age man 18 to find draft dodgers. Yeah, well, there are ways that you can find manpower. I mean, we talked about this before. Hey, if you really put your mind to it, you can find manpower. You can go, there's a lot of parts of the world where there are a lot of poor people, and you offer them some money, and hey, you send them to Ukraine. You can go to Africa where there's an abundance of manpower, and you can do it. If the Europeans and the Americans are determined to keep the war going, they will find the manpower. You can absolutely find the manpower. We're in Africa where there's an abundance of people. You go and find. Hey, you offer them a $30,000 signing bonus. There's a lot of people going to do that. Hey, $30,000. That's going to take you a long way. So absolutely, you can always find manpower if you're determined to do it. That's why when people say, "Oh, they don't have the manpower," yeah, in Ukraine probably they don't have the manpower. But let's also keep in mind that even if you don't go to Africa and Asia for the additional manpower, the issue is still whether you can go on keep the war going. In other words, you by forcing Russia to keep fighting and not really coming to a conclusion, and that's really the issue. I mean, the assumption has been that somehow Ukraine, and we've heard this many times, Ukraine will collapse, and maybe it will. I mean, that may happen, but it may not. Ukraine, NATO, Ukraine, whichever, they've become quite sophisticated at building their defenses. They're building up their defense lines. So even making these breakthroughs in Donetsk, that's quite a tall order. I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's going to be a tall order. And that's the Europeans' calculation, which is keep this war going until it'll be Russia that'll be weakened. Not saying that in itself necessarily will happen, but if you're trying to figure out how what the plan is, then I think it's you keep it going, and then wait for the appropriate moment when Europe, in alliance with the United States, can get directly involved. So here was an article that was published today in this website, War on the Rocks. I don't particularly like it, and because it's quite tendentious. Obviously, they're very pro-Ukraine, tend to be pro-NATO, But I thought this article was interesting in that it revealed the thinking that prevails in NATO land. And what they're going back to are wars in the past. They think, okay, well, let's think about other wars that Russia had been involved in, and the Crimean War, the war against Japan, um, and what happened there. And the conclusion of this article, which is that, hey, well, in each of these cases, it was the West using a proxy against Russia, and thereby essentially, continuing to keep the war going. And I think there is some truth to that. That's how that much of these wars have been a way of weakening Russia. The West using, whether it was Japan or whether it was the Ottomans, in order to weaken Russia. So here's this article. Let's see. There's some war on the rocks, and here we have the imperial trap, Russia's war in Ukraine, and the lessons of failed conquest. Now, this is very tendentious, and so I'm not saying, oh well, this is this we should believe what it says. I'm just showing that this is the calculation that the West is undertaking. And so what they're doing is it's not irrational. It may turn out to be wrong, but it's not totally irrational. He says, lost amid these Ukrainian setbacks is the fact that for the first time since the spring of 2022, Russia too appears interested in substantive negotiations. And that willingness suggests that while Moscow has managed thus far to maintain the upper hand on the battlefield, the political, social, and economic difficulties it faces are also building, and with them the risks that the war poses to Russian political and social stability. And then goes on. In that sense, the conflict in Ukraine is unfolding similarly to others in Russia's long history of failed or inconclusive imperial wars. Several times in the past few centuries, Russian leaders launched wars of conquest against foes they misunderstood and underestimated, and with little appreciation of the larger international context. The longer each conflict dragged on, the more strain it placed on an under institutionalized Russian economy and political system. In these earlier instances, the inability to sustain a long war compelled leaders to pull back, sometimes too late to save their regime, a pattern that is not unique to Russia. President Putin's Russia therefore faces many of the same risks, both because it has chosen to fight an old fashioned imperial war in the 21st century and because the Russian Federation suffers from many of the same structural weaknesses as imperial and Soviet predecessors. While it would be simplistic to say that Putin's Russia will necessarily traverse the exact path they did, previously failed wars of conquest or other imperial interventions offer some insights into what the enduring consequences of Russia's Ukrainian misadventures could be. So, as I say, I'm not endorsing this. I'm just saying that this is what the calculation is, how they're thinking, and so all of this is geared towards the proxy. This in this case, Ukraine, to keep Ukraine engaged in Russia, and they did that with Japan. I mean, this was a war. Japan in 1904 launched this war against Russia. And Japan would not have prevailed against Russia, even though everyone writes with delight, "Oh, Japan won! Japan won!" Well, Japan only won, if you could call it a win, because they were helped by the British. And the wars were against the Ottomans. in the 19th century, each time the Ottomans were supported by the British and the French, and always it was done in order to weaken and push back Russia. And I think so. I think the historical analogy of what the West is doing, it is does it is appropriate to look back on in the 19th century and see how um, the West fought against Russia by continually arming, financing, supporting various proxies against Russia. Um, and so here, let's see if we can go on. Um, yeah. To understand the strains that the invasion is placing on Russia, it is useful to compare the invasion of Ukraine with earlier examples of Russia's imperial wars. While Putin constantly connects his war in Ukraine to the historical memory of World War II, Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine more closely resembles failed Russian imperial wars of the past: the Crimean War, the Russo-Japanese War, World War I, and Soviet-Afghan War. Um, and then this is here you see he talks about Russia's failure in these wars stemmed from common mistakes and shortcomings that also afflict Putin's war. And then Emperor Nicholas I expected the Ottoman Empire to quickly give way unto his demand for a protectorate over Orthodox Christians in what is now Moldova and part of Romania, while Emperor Nicholas II and his commanders believed the Japanese military could never stand up to a European great power. And similar hubris colored their assessments of the Ottomans in 1914-15, and when they settled on seizing Constantinople and the Black Sea Strait as the war aims. Now, what's interesting here is this is the bias, the ridiculous bias of the authors of this article, which is somehow always delegitimizes Russia, but somehow Anglo-French imperialism is fine. I mean, this was, basically it was the Russians were indeed the protectors of the Orthodox Christians. I mean, there's no question. They were the protectors of the Orthodox Christians. And when Russia failed, thanks to the British, when Russia failed to protect the Orthodox Christians by essentially preventing the defeat of the Ottomans, well, the Orthodox Christians were massacred. I mean, no British intervention against the Russians, no massacre of the Bulgarians, no British intervention to save the Ottomans, no massacre of the Armenians. So the Russians were indeed the protectors of the Orthodox Christians in the Balkans and in the Middle East. The British, however, were using the Ottomans to, as part of the Great Game, to thwart Russia. But this is par for the course to always talk about, whether the Russian imperial ambitions are illegitimate. Why are Japanese ambitions legitimate? Why was the Japanese ambition in 1904 legitimate? Well, well, they and then thanks to the support for the Japanese, well, that may contributed to the problem with Japanese imperialism after World War One. So, but this is par for the course, and so that's why if you think of how the Europeans are thinking these days, they are thinking entirely along those lines that they did in the 19th century. Well, hey, the enemy is Russia. Russia needs to be pushed back. We have to do everything we can in order to push Russia out of Europe once and for all. So that's how they are, calculating this. Um, and so let's just go on for a little bit more with that article. Um, It says, second, Russian leaders frequently downplayed the risks and impacts of foreign, Western involvement that ended up prolonging the war and increasing the costs Russia was forced to bear. The landing of French and British troops in Crimea in 1854 forced Russia to fight on multiple fronts against better equipped armies. British intelligence support enabled Tokyo to remain a step ahead of the Russian plans throughout the Russo Japanese War. While Russia declared war against Austria Hungary in August 1914, it soon found itself at war with Germany, the Ottomans, and Bulgaria as well. A German Ottoman blockade of the Black Sea Straits choked off Allied support, exacerbating the Tsarist government's inability to mobilize defense production. And then the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan prompted the United States, in an easy alliance with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, to arm the Mujahideen, forces that ground down the Soviet army until Gorbachev ordered their withdrawal nearly a decade later. Now, notice again what they're doing here. First of all, the account of World War One is just ludicrous. And it's almost can be written in Berlin or in Vienna. Russia never declared war on Austria-Hungary. Russia didn't even declare war on Germany. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on an absurd pretext. Without any real evidence that that Serbia was involved in the assassination of the Archduke. They declared war on Serbia when Serbia refused to abide by the ultimatum. All Russia did is that he began to mobilize when Austria-Hungary, because basically they couldn't just sit back and allow Austria-Hungary in alliance with Germany to crush its ally Serbia. Germany then ordered Russia to stop mobilizing. That's all Russia was doing, was ordered Germany to stop mobilizing. Russia did not stop, and Germany then declared war on Russia. Now he says here Russia never declared war on Austria-Hungary. Russia did not declare war on Germany. It was Austria-Hungary and Germany together that provoked this war with Serbia, and then Germany declared war on Russia. Then he says, "Oh well, they blockaded the Black Sea, and so that was a real problem for Russia." Yeah, because Russia had an obligation to France. Russia was trying to help France out in 1914, and that is the way in which this war. But to put it as if Russia was somehow engaged in an imperial war. I mean, if you're going to say Russia was engaged in an imperial war in 1914 through to 1917, then you could absolutely say, as were England and France and Germany. They were all engaged in imperial war, and they all were basically working out deals with one another for who was going to get what piece of territory after the war. I mean, we had all of those treaties, those secret treaties that were negotiated during World War One, and so yeah, Russia was absolutely concerned with what he was going to take, and were the British, as were the British. But this is the way that it's presented. So somehow, well, everyone else's imperial ambitions are presumed legitimate. I mean, with this author, even Germany says, "Oh, well, that was perfectly reasonable." for Germany and Austria-Hungary to to instigate a war with Serbia. Perfectly reasonable for Germany and Austria-Hungary to blockade the Russians in the Black Sea. So they couldn't get so the Allies were not able to provide Russia with munitions. Oh, that's fine. That's fine. Um, but what that would tend to confirm is that the Russians were vulnerable, and obviously this is the Dardanelles was a source of vulnerability for them, and always has been a source of vulnerability for them. Um, but all that is goes to show that ultimately, as this author presented, the Western powers can get together and decide to minimize Russian presence in Europe, Russian presence in the Middle East, and then you've got this smug view. Well, that's fine. This we're that's the way we should deal with Russia. Um, Now, so going back to the question, what's the plan here? The plan is, and this is why I thought this article is worth looking at, even though the history is very dubious, but why it's worth looking at is that the Western powers are thinking in terms of what ultimately Russia does not have the economic strength that we have. And that once we pool our resources together, and once we can go on um, with this grinding war, as long as Ukraine can keep going, then by 2030, Russia will be severely weakened. Um, Now, why I don't think this is a wholly unreasonable calculation is that look, if you keep a war, you could keep a war going 5, 6, 7, 8 years. That is exhausting. You're taking severe casualties, um, and you're taking economic blows. Um, that's why I certainly agree with those who said that Russia should have wrapped up this war at a much earlier date, and that this notion, which was repeated over and over again, particularly during the first 2, 3 years of the war, that time is on Russia's side. Time is on Russia's side. Well, I don't think time is on Russia's side. Yeah, time. You have the time is on Russia's side if it's just fighting Ukraine, but Russia isn't just fighting Ukraine. Russia is fighting NATO in Ukraine, and if NATO is determined to keep this war going, they'll keep the war going. And that's why when you read this, people look at these historical analogies, say, yeah, this is what we did in the Crimean War. We kept it going, and we prevailed. Now, World War One was a kind of an interesting case because this was a war Russia clearly should have stayed out of. I mean, up until then, Russia had been quite shrewd in staying out of wars with Germany. There was a threat that Russia may get involved in a war over the annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Russia avoided a war then. Then there were the various Balkan wars, and I thought, well, maybe Russia will get involved there. Russia did not get involved. But then it got involved in 1914, and that was not. And there, I think it was pressure from France. So this is again the problem with Russia, that it does um, it tends to get itself, into uh, dangerous situations out of eagerness to help the West, of the very West that has no real time for Russia. It's not clear at all why Russia should have done anything in 1914 to help France. France had got itself into its own mess, and but Russia was decided to help out France, and of course got absolutely walloped by Germany. But of course, but you know the loss in World War I was, of course, facilitated by the Bolsheviks. But that goes with the territory. I mean, if you have, anytime you have a war um, that isn't going particularly well, you're always going to have agitators, and you're always going to have dissent, and so that you have to always calculate on how long can we keep this war going until there is serious dissent at home that will um, prevent our fighting properly. And this is absolutely goes to the heart of that Russia should have wrapped up this war much earlier. It would have been difficult, um, because it would have entailed um, some severe measures taken against Ukraine that would have been very unpopular uh, globally, but it would have ended it quickly. Um, the longer something goes on, the more dangerous it becomes, and the more then things can go wrong. And that really is the way the Europeans are calculating this, and they just keep this going. Anyway, let's take a look at the comments among Gagglers. This is the people within the Gaggle community who ensure that the dogs are looked after, cared for, that they remain in a reasonable mood. They don't get upset and depressed, and thinking that why are they being left out? Why aren't they being rewarded? So thank you, Gagglers. Thank you. I really appreciate your generosity. So thank you for everything you've done through this year. And let's um, and so here we have Carlos. Carlos, good to see you, Carlos. And he says, I think it's about finding what works for oneself when it comes to health. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, apropos of what we were talking about. Yeah, that's right. So, yeah, I mean, some people can indeed, you know, be grossly overweight, but still live to a reasonable age. I mean, I don't think it's not recommended, but I mean, I don't think it's good for you to be so overweight. But Wells pulled it off. I don't know. I mean, I think to live to the age of 70 when you've been for years, you've been so grossly overweight, and particularly in his case when he was the butt of so much really unpleasant humor, and people thought that this was whenever he was on Carson, and people would always think that it's perfectly appropriate to make jokes about his weight, but nonetheless he continued with it, and and still still managed to live to 70. um, anyway, Carlos, Merry Christmas from snowy Ottawa. Huh, that's kind of nice. That's quite pretty. um, and then so uh, yeah, so that's Cynthia replies to the picture of the snowy Ottawa. What a stunning church. The dusting of snow adds such a magical, serene touch. Yeah, yeah, I agree. That looks quite pretty. That's really nice. Anyway, Cynthia, thank you so much, Cynthia, for your generosity, and thank you, Cynthia, really for all that you've done over the past year. You know, Cynthia, as everyone knows, is a resident film scholar, film expert, film commenter, critic, and who regularly informs us about the films that we screen here. You know, does a prodigious amount of research and enormous work into researching and to pro- providing fascinating background information and fascinating details about the production of films, the history of films, but actors, directors, and everything. It's just an amazing amount of information that Cynthia tells us every week, and it makes the whole of our screenings, our film club, Monday night screenings, a particularly special experience. I mean, there's nothing like this anywhere on the internet. There's nothing like this, certainly in any of our locals communities. So it's quite a remarkable thing. You know, you get to watch a great film, and you find out an awful lot about the film. And so you don't have to go and say, "Oh, do your own research. All your research has already been done for you." So thank you, Cynthia. Thank you for so much over the past year. And yesterday we showed the first part of Marcel Ophus's remarkable documentary from 1969 about France under German occupation. It was The Sorrow and the Pity. We're going to show the second part next Monday. And so I say, really watch this. This is a fascinating documentary. And as you watch it, read Cynthia's, really, really interesting and informed comments. I learned a lot. I knew something about this film, but I still managed to learn a great deal from what Cynthia contributed. So anyway, so part one, you can watch it now. Part two, next Monday. Anyway, Cynthia says, until I watched last night's film, I wasn't familiar with the Maginot Line or its metaphorical weight. The phrase Paris ladies planting roses along the Maginot Line perfectly captured the French upper classes' Maginot mentality and their utterly misplaced priorities. So I'd love to hear you weave that into future podcasts, perhaps alongside other evocative terms like salami slicing or gated globalization, or even your reliable staples like circling the wagons and a bridge too far. Yeah, I guess so. A bridge too far. I guess it's one of my favorite phrases. And when you repeat the phrase all the time, it kind of becomes a cliche, and a bridge too far is a bit of a cliche. The Maginot Line is a very interesting story because, in a way, it wasn't wholly absurd what the French did. They kind of built this defense on its eastern border against Germany, um, and the, the problem that they had was it was never really finished. So what happened in 1940 was, in a way, I mean, what the French were expecting was that the main German thrust would be, as in 1914, would go through Belgium, through the Low Countries, and then move towards Paris. That's what their expectation. So that, okay, we've got the Maginot Line, so they're not going to go through here. They're going to go through Belgium and the Low Countries. That's what they did in 1914, and they almost won. But that's not what they did. The attack through the Low Countries in 1940 was really a distraction. The main thrust of the Germans was in Sedan, where the Maginot Line was not completed, and that's where the main German attack took place, and that I think caught the French by surprise, and and led to the quite swift defeat. So it was different from the 1914 attack, because here the main thrust was through the Rhineland and into France proper. It didn't go through the Low Countries. So the the Maginot Line kind of becomes a joke, because in a way, I mean, they built it, but they didn't really complete it. By failing to complete it, that was it gave the Germans the opening. But they caught them by surprise. They weren't. That's not what they were expecting. They weren't expecting the German attack at Sedan. The film itself is really quite interesting, and I think why it, it's really worth watching, um, because the the feeling in France in 1940 really was, there was a lot of resentment, real resentment. I mean, obviously France had been defeated. I mean, France had obviously, they were very proud of their performance in World War One. They survived. They were almost defeated in 1914, but they managed to survive, and came out victorious in 1918. And so they were very proud of their performance. But the French really didn't think they could do it again. They thought that this it was a kind of a one-off, and there were reasons for that. First of all, Russia was no longer a factor. So, as I was saying earlier, some of the pressure that was applied against France in 1914 was relieved because the Russians had mounted their own offensive against Germany in East Prussia. So the Germans had to move some of their forces to the east to defeat the Russians, and that means that ultimately the Germans didn't have the force with which they could just take Paris in August 1914. And then from then on, once the Germans failed to take it, then the war could be stretched out. But now, with Russia no longer a factor, and with the British really not really committing themselves to a continental commitment, a permanent presence in France, France just didn't think that it could possibly take on Germany. I mean, it was they just they just knew that it took Britain, France, Russia, the United States together to defeat Germany in World War One. Now Britain's out, no continental commitment. Russia's out. They're not aligned with France anymore. The United States obviously is out. And I thought, we're not going to take on Germany. I mean, Germany, is basically by population was twice the size of France. So the French really just didn't think they could possibly prevail in 1940. But when the Pétain sued for peace, and essentially established this new government, the Vichy government, the ethos of Vichy was saying, we're not going to go back to the decadent, depraved France that was defeated in 1940. I mean, all the terrible things that took place in that France, all the corruption, all the decadence, the defeatism, and the Jews. And so we just don't want any of that. So part of the sort of the ethos of Vichy was, yeah, we lost. Why did we lose? We lost because of all these horrible communists, all these horrible Jews, um, and, um, and the general atmosphere of defeatism. So part of what Vichy was about was a kind of reinvigorating France with a kind of moral, upstanding values, a little bit like Germany, the upstanding values that the Germans had. Um, so so when and you get a sense of this in the documentary when they start talking about the Jews and embracing some of the slogans of Nazi Germany. I think it was in reaction to the the France that had been defeated. And I think there's one of those guys says, better the fascist than Leon Blum, who was the socialist leader of the Popular Front. And so this really comes out in this film that Vichy was really a response to the defeatism that had prevailed in France before 1940. And then, so there was, a lot of it was blamed on the Jews for the defeatism, and of course Leon Blum had been a Jew. And then there was a real resentment against the British, um, and a real serious resentment against the British, and particularly when the British attacked the French Navy in Algeria. The ostensible reason for the British attack was that the British were afraid that Germany would take over France's navy, and that would, of course, give Germany huge naval strength relative to the British. Now, the French said, well, this is very unreasonable because we signed an armistice agreement with Germany whereby we would retain our naval power. Germany would not appropriate our naval power. And if they did try to appropriate our ships, we would scuttle them. We would scuttle them before handing them over to the Germans. Now, the British, with Churchill, said, well, we don't accept that. We don't believe it. And so they launched this attack against the navy, the ships that were in Algeria. Because the defense, they could do it there. They couldn't do it at Toulon because Toulon, the French had very strong defenses there. The British would not have succeeded in destroying the ships there. They're just very powerful anti-aircraft fire there. The British would not have succeeded. But in Algeria, they could do it. So this British attack on the French ships in 1940, this was July 1940. This attack caused the death of some 1,300 French sailors. 1,300 French sailors who were killed by the British. The very British that they thought were their allies. They killed 1,300 of our sailors, and this, of course, caused a great deal of anger among the French. And indeed, Pétain broke off diplomatic relations with the British after this attack. So there was this was the Anglophobia that dominated Vichy, and particularly when they suspected that this wasn't really because they thought that the Germans were going to take over the French ships. This was really Churchill hitting the French out of bitterness and resentment over the French armistice, that the French had signed this armistice agreement with the Germans in 1940, The British were angry, were pissed off. They thought, hey, this, we had a deal. We wouldn't sign separate peace agreements, but France did sign a separate peace agreement, and the French thought that that's the reason why the British launched this attack against the French. That it was just bit resentment over the armistice agreement. So that was the cause of the Anglophobia, because there was the anti-Semitism, um, and so that's why it's the documentary is so striking, because you're watching this, and I mean the British have been kind of resentful about the French, they lost, blah, 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 but the British have always kind of despised the French, um, and this even came out, in the documentary. Like, the Germans also despised the French. The Germans always regarded the British as like them. They're similar to them. They're kind of northern European people. Rather than these sort of Gallic barbarians. Uh, but there's some of that attitude the British themselves shared. Hey, they find the Germans much more sympathetic than they ever found the French. But anyway, but the British despised the French for capitulating in 1940, and they retained that contempt for years and years. This after World War II, despite they're supposed to be allies and we're friends, whatever, blah, blah, but the British always maintained that resentment against the French. But you can see the French point of view, because ultimately it was the French who had to face the might of the Wehrmacht pretty much on their own. The British contribution was pretty minimal, and were easily defeated. I mean, it was the British who had to scarper in 1940 at Dunkirk. So, so therefore you could just see why there would be resentment towards towards the British. Now, things changed a little bit as the war went on, particularly after 1943 and the German defeat of Stalingrad. And I think the French then began, to resist much more the Germans, which they hadn't really for the first 3 years of the war, but they began, to resist. But just going back to the film, I think is just really striking. The attitudes that that dominated Vichy. Why they were just so angry with the British, and but also just angry with the people who Petain and the rest of them thought had betrayed France, had let France down. Anyway, Cynthia, thank you, and let's go on. And then Robert says, if the treatment of Jacques Bourde is any indication, you wonder if the AFD will be neutralized by way of EU sanctions rather than by way of German courts. Well, that's an interesting thing. But I would think that if it were just sanctions, a political party probably can pay the fines or whatever means they will they will try to sanction the AFD by. The German courts, I would think, will be the primary way in which they would move against the AFD. And I thought that what they would do is say, well, this is fascist, this is Nazi, the usual thing. They're a threat to our constitution, a threat to our democracy. They've made these arguments against the AFD for years. But now I'm inclined to think that it's the way that they've moved against Jacques Baud. And now, what's interesting about the sanctions against him is that, you know, to hit an individual with sanctions is really quite sinister and quite frightening, because this is without a trial. I mean, he's being hit with sanctions without his having been put on trial, without a prosecutor presenting a case against him, without a case against him being adjudicated by a court of law, and then the court of law deciding whether there's a case or there's not a case, and then if there is, what the punishment should be. So this is really a punishment without a trial. This is a punishment really without any kind of a legal proceeding. It's not just they didn't have a trial, there's just no legal proceeding. I mean, it's not like they haven't even brought an indictment, so that you can at least see what it is you're being charged with. So none of that was done with him. And so if you sanction somebody without anything like that, then you're in a really dangerous and dark place. Because then you're punishing people without any due process, without any kind of a legal determination. So that's now in the. I mean, I think in the case of the AFD, that's more or less what they're doing. I don't think they can make much of a case against the AFD other than by maintaining this momentum among the sort of public opinion. So public opinion, you can bring up, the fascists and Hitler and so on, but that's not enough. But if you suggest they are working for the Russians, and if you then say, yeah, and we're at war with Russia, then you have a basis by which you can punish a party without any kind of a legal procedure. I mean, what kind of you don't need a legal procedure. I mean, when the British imprisoned the fascists, the British Union of Fascists during World War II, was Oswald Mosley, his wife, and members of the British Union of Fascists. There was also no legal proceeding. They were obviously working for Hitler. We're at war with Hitler. So they were imprisoned. I mean, same with the Japanese Americans in the United States. There's no real legal procedure. You're just punishing people without giving them any means of defending themselves. So Jacques Baud was sanctioned, but he had no means to present a defense. I mean, there wasn't even a case brought against him. You can't even bring a defense if there's no case to answer. So I think that there will probably be something like that in Germany once this war begins to once the public begins to accept we are now effectively at war with Russia. I mean, Annalena Baerbock, of course, said this, when was it, 2022? I can't remember what year. She said it early on, we're at war with Russia. But once this becomes accepted, and Merz was saying, look, we are sacrificing so much for this war. Look at the amount of money we're spending on our military. We're running into debt. How can we allow a political party to act as the mouthpiece of the Kremlin? Or, what was it that the guy, we were reading this out, Trojan horse. They're Putin's Trojan horse. So I whether it's going to be done by the courts or by some kind of a government decree, either way, I think it's coming. I think they are going to outlaw the AFD, and I'm not at all sure the AFD is going to be able to do anything. I mean, what are they going to do? Okay, they've been outlawed. I mean, they can certainly petition the courts, say this was illegal, unjust, and whatever. But the courts in Germany will, unquestionably, they will side with the government. They always have in the past. They will side with the government. Yeah, well, hey, we're at war, and you're working for the Kremlin. I mean, that's what the Bundesnachrichtendienst has told us. You know that they've said they've presided us with. They've shown us that you are working for Putin. Here are the documents. You're working for Putin. Therefore, you can't function as a political party in a democracy. I mean, it's going to be very easy. In Germany, of all places, it's going to be very easy to just to say you are clearly in violation of the constitution. You are not a legitimate political party. You are a tool of the Kremlin, and we are at war with the Kremlin. That's it. There's no getting out of that. There's no defense of that. That's done. So I think that's the way it's going to go in Germany. Anyway, Robert, thank you so much. Really appreciate your generosity. And Anne Marie, thank you so much. It says, good evening, George and Gagglers. And I hope the dogs will forgive me for my stingy tip, all the more they should be for a decent Christmas bone. But I currently have some temporary credit card issues, but I haven't been sanctioned as of yet. Well, I don't know. Maybe you have been sanctioned. I mean, you never know. I mean, it could be that your contributions here at the Gaggle have been, you've been put on a list of sanctioned individuals. And since you live in Switzerland, who knows? You might be quite friendly with Jacques Baud. I think you even once wrote something about Jacques Baud on the Gaggles page. So I'm putting two and two together, and I suspect you may be under sanction. So I hope that's not the case, but I wouldn't rule it out. But anyways, thank you so much for your generosity, and of course, thank you as always for for your generosity in providing us with so much really fascinating and insightful commentary on music during the past year, especially whenever we post our pieces of music. Anne Marie always graces us with this really, really insightful comments, observations, thoughts, coming from a person who has played at the highest levels in sort of some of the finest orchestras in the world, and worked with some of the finest musical practitioners and conductors and composers of our time. And so, knowing music from the inside the way you do, your comments are always resonant with the rich and deep insights that come with that kind of experience. So we're very appreciative of everything that you have done. So thank you so much for everything you've contributed over the past year. And then Stone River. Thank you, Stone River, always for your generosity. Stone River says, whatever happened to the EU as a Nobel Peace Project? Was it a fraud from the beginning? That's a really, really interesting question. It may well have been a fraud from the beginning. We think in terms of, well, obviously, there they are. They went through that process, all students go through learning. Oh yeah, there was the coal and steel community. There was the Treaty of Rome, and then we had the common market, and then they expanded this the common market. It was a free trade area, and then economic cooperation, and and so on, and oh yeah, that sounds great. How wonderful it is. And but it may well be, when we look back upon it now, in retrospect, we see that it may implicit within the project was was a determination to be the political arm of NATO. And because you had EU and NATO, and we all kind of pretended that, oh, well, they're two separate tracks. The EU, that's fine. They're doing, they're just doing things like business and coal and steel, and, the common market, something, that's it. But step by step, they were creating a super state. And and every time they did it, you said, well, you thought, well, hey, I'm not at all happy about this. We said, okay, it'll be a common market. That sounds all right. But now you're creating a common currency. Now you're creating common political institutions. And now you've become the political arm of Ukraine. And so the EU now really doesn't do anything other than spread war propaganda. Every time you see Ursula von der Leyen, she has nothing whatever to say about internal affairs in Europe. Do you have anything to say about agriculture, construction, energy, the environment, all of the issues? You think, well, shouldn't you be addressing those issues? No, no, no. All she addresses is Russia, Russia, Russia. And not only that, she has hired, and she's the president of the commission, she has hired, as part of her team, the worst kind of Russophobes. So, in other words, all the people who work for her, not just Kaya Kallas, but so Kaya Kallas, she's the one who does the foreign policy, but the person who does the defense, EU defense. And again, you wonder, why is there a person handling EU defense? I thought the EU was, as Stone River says, a peace project, but you have an EU defense, and I think he's from one of the Baltic states. So that foreign policy and defense are handled by citizens of the Baltic states. And that's what, and this is what Ursula von der Leyen, has adopted as the project of the EU. And then you have Merz, he doesn't even hide his goal of preparing for a war with Russia. He's a German. He doesn't even hide this anymore. Any more than Annalena Baerbock. And we just mentioned how she said, we're at war with Russia. So, it's like we all those years we're saying, oh, the Russians, the Germans, they're very different. They've changed. No, they're now they're just peace. They're uninterested in peace. Turns out that was very premature. Once they didn't feel the need to pretend how much they've changed. Oh, we're completely different people. We just want to be friends with our neighbors. We just want to not make trouble at all. Once they now don't feel the need to pretend, the stuff that's coming out from Germany, that's not too different from what was coming out from Germany before World War II and what was coming out from Germany before World War I. And I've said this before, but when Helmut Kohl, October the 3rd, 1990, is famous, sends a letter to every single head of state in the world, declaring henceforth only peace will emanate from German soil. October the 3rd, 1990, the day of unification. And then, within a few months, what does Germany do? Germany recognizes the secession of Croatia and Slovenia. And that's it. You've gone back to all of your ways of helping to break up the states around you, and particularly Yugoslavia, which has always been a bane of Germany, with all their ambitions in the Balkans and hatred for the Serbs. And there it is. It took just a few months after henceforth only peace will emanate from German soil to essentially facilitate the breakup of Yugoslavia and therefore the civil wars that broke out in Yugoslavia as a result of that. So, and that kind of infuses everything that the EU does. So, was it there from the beginning? I'd say that they had to pretend for a while that it was entirely a peace project. Why did they pretend? Well, I think in the case of Germany, Germany needed to keep a low profile um, if they were ever going to get reunification. There was no way anyone was going to allow reunification unless Germany could show that they have changed. We're nothing like what we used to be. So they had to do that. And of course, there was the presence of the Soviet Union, which did focus minds and did um, instill fear, genuine fear, in Europe, because unlike today's Russia, Soviet Union looked scary. They looked like they were not joking. They were not kidding around. Um, and but Russia today just doesn't inspire that kind of a fear. So in response to that, the EU said, "Well, we're a peace project. We're not here to cause any offense to anybody." But now there's just no way in the world anyone's going to believe that the EU is a peace project. It's aggressive, not just towards Russia, but it's aggressive towards its own member states. And so any member state that doesn't play ball, you got the full might of Brussels coming down on you. I mean, we've seen what they do with Orban. We've seen what they did in Romania when Romania threatened to vote the wrong way. Now we see what they're doing with Bart de Wever, the Belgian prime minister. That they may still win that one. And of course, you see what they do against Serbia. You see how they threaten Moldova. Hey, you better vote the way we want you to, or the consequences could be quite severe. So there's really, there's very little, very little here about democracy in anything the EU does. Very little here about peace. And when was it that they won the Nobel Peace Prize? 2012. I don't know. I think. But even then, it was already ridiculous. I mean, there was enough evidence what the EU was up to make you think, like, this is absolutely idiotic to give the EU the Nobel Peace Prize. Anyway, so that's thank you, Stone River. And then here's Apple is Tiny Tim. There's Apple. Yes, that does look like Apple. Yeah, you can see this is his what the hell's going on with the tip jar routine. Not happy. not happy here. The tip jar situation is just definitely not not to his liking. Love the knife and fork around his plate. And then Aristotle 1, good to see you. Thank you so much, Aristotle. And he says, so why do you suppose Trump went so far out of his way to close down the Epstein situation? Don't you think only Israel could make him stick his neck out so far? That's a very good question. I think he had probably, I'm just speculating here, felt that this had all the makings of a new Russiagate. I think he was probably told by Pam Bondi that, these Epstein files, there's a lot of mention of you in them. And remember when Elon Musk, when he and Trump were going at it, and Musk said, "Oh, Trump's name is in the Epstein files." That Trump was thinking that, we publish this, and the CNN and MSNBC and everyone in Congress is just going to pile on and use this as a new Russiagate. That somehow Trump um, and Epstein were, involved in, marketing, um, underage girls and so on, and he's not going to be able to get himself out of it. It's going to be the next 2 years are just going to be Epstein Gate. And he wasn't wholly wrong about that, because if you just look at the media coverage of Epstein, it's all obsessed with Trump. I mean, look at all the headlines in today's papers, and they're all saying, "Oh, Trump's name is all over the Epstein files." Epstein, Trump. Now, it is true that Epstein, despite the fact that he and Trump had a falling out whenever it was about 2004, that had a falling out, but Epstein was filled with resentment towards Trump and was quite obsessed with Trump. I mean, he was, so I think he was corresponding with his friends and invariably saying very, very negative things about Trump. I mean, I think he was obviously upset with the way Trump had treated him, but even more upset with Trump's rise to the presidency, which no one was really expecting. I mean, if you were around in 2004, 2005, or whatever, you didn't take Trump very seriously. It was just he's a man who was always showboating, promoting himself, kind of entertaining. You watch him on Larry King or whatever, but you couldn't take him seriously as a political figure. I'm sure Epstein also, he just didn't take him seriously. He was just someone who you can go partying with. But nonetheless, Trump went on to become president. So, which often happens. I mean, if you have a falling out with somebody, and then that person you have a falling out with goes from success to success to success, while you have kind of, your career has been kind of in a downturn, particularly after his conviction in Florida. You can see he became very, very resentful towards Trump, and so he did indeed obsess over Trump and wrote to people about Trump over the years. So therefore, you look at the Epstein files, there's an awful lot of references to Trump in them. And so the media are running with this because they think, hey, we've got something to bash Trump with. So you can see Trump's calculations that, hey, they're going to use this as the new Russiagate. And they may still do that. There may still be something in those files that the Democrats are going to can use against him when they move to impeach him in 2027. So I think why did Trump do this? I think he's genuinely afraid that this is going to be used against him, and I think. I have sympathy with him. I mean, when he was asked, I think yesterday, what do you think about these pictures of Bill Clinton? I think he said, I think this is ridiculous that you're posting all these pictures of people who were friendly with Epstein. And they said, well, everybody was friendly with Epstein, but did they do anything wrong? I mean, just because, well, you're swimming in a pool or in a hot tub or whatever, doesn't mean you did actually anything wrong. And I think that's very reasonable. So when they post these pictures of Trump, of Clinton or Trump or Prince Andrew, and then you have these women but their faces are blacked out, then it's obviously just very, very unfair, because the suggestion is when you see these kinds of pictures is something very untoward is going on, and that these women are somehow victims. Their privacy must be um, protected, but the privacy of people who actually haven't done anything wrong, they were just whatever, they're I don't know, hanging out with grown women. I mean, these are grown women. Um, it may be sleazy. There's no evidence that any of these women were underage. They're grown women. Clinton or Trump, whatever, they were hanging out with them. But by putting these, blacking out these pictures, the suggestion that all these people were doing something really horrific, and people's reputations have indeed been unfairly tarnished. I still haven't seen anything that Prince Andrew did that's wrong. I'm not a huge fan of Prince Andrew, never have been, but I think he's been very unfairly humiliated, stripped of honor, stripped of all his dignity, um, treated like a pariah, lost his titles and everything. And at the same time, what has he done? What just what he had a bad interview with the BBC. So, he had a terrible interview with the BBC. Okay, well, he's not. That's not what he does. That's he's royalty. He goofs around. He's not a pro when it comes to handling adversarial interviews. I mean, he didn't prepare for that interview, and it went badly. I mean, as these interviews tend to do. But what has he done to deserve the humiliation that he's had to undergo? So I think this is a lot of people are really being absolutely dragged through the mud just simply because they've been friends with Epstein, and but they haven't actually. There's no evidence they've done anything wrong. So I think Trump, I think, has a point there. As I say, I think that he just saw this as a Russiagate, and that it's just going to you know uh, becloud his second term, just as Russiagate beclouded his first term. But of course, the way he went about it was really self-defeating, because there's no way you're going to stop this. I mean, once people want to get this information out, they want to get those pictures out, they want to get all those files out. You can't stop this. I mean, it's you're wasting your time trying to prevent publication. I mean, you're going to lose. So I think he he did manage to get the worst of all worlds there. Well, some Schlumbucket returns and says, "Well, if the girl in the hot tub with Big Bubba was underage, then yeah, there was something wrong with it." Yeah, that's true, but there's no evidence that they were underage. And incidentally, there's no evidence that Trump or Clinton really ever had a thing for underage girls. They may have liked young girls, but there's no evidence that they had any interest in underage girls. I mean, over the years, we know a lot about all the Clinton's women. I mean, we all know all of them. The Juanita Brodericks, the one in the impeachment, and the one that he assaulted in the Oval Office. Lewinsky, Monica Lewinsky. They were all overage. They were all mature women. So there's no reason to start thinking, oh, this girl is underage. I think that's just an unfair assumption. Now, I agree. Clinton is certainly a sleazebag. He always has been. But That was known about Clinton from the beginning. We knew this in 1992 when he ran for the presidency, and all that came out right away. The bimbo eruptions and Jennifer Flowers and everything else. Everything was known about it. He still won the 92 election, and he was reelected in 96 when everything was already known about Bill Clinton. So you can't now, start, pretending to be shocked and appalled by, the way he conducts himself. Um, Then Todd says, so far they haven't presented any pictures that show women that look dramatically underage, and it's not like each photo comes with an ID and age. No, I mean, that's right. I mean, I don't think I haven't seen any pictures that suggest that these people are underage, and then no one is implying that. The reason they are blacking these faces out is, I think, they want to create this atmosphere that somehow there's something horrific going on here, that these are the most sordid orgies involving underage girls, and so they have to black out these faces. I don't think anyone's face should be blacked out unless they are indeed underage. But I think if you're, if you're, a woman in your 20s and you're hanging around with Bill Clinton and Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump, why are you hanging around them? Well, because they're cool guys and they have lots of money, and they have great parties, and and they're very important, and they can help out your career, and that's why they were hanging out with Jeffrey Epstein. And from what one can gather, he was quite generous to all these women that he was friendly with. But nonetheless, people may be immature, but if you're in your 20s, you are legally an adult, and you have taken your own decisions to hang out with people like Jeffrey Epstein and Bill Clinton. I mean, that's it. That's the way it goes. You're legally of age, and therefore you are responsible for your decisions. So there's no point in now pretending, they're victims. They're not victims. If you're 19, 20, you're not a victim. You're legally of age. I mean, you may be immature, but people are immature. But legally, that's not that terminology that counts. So the way the media present it is that somehow, they're somehow the victims. They're victims. No. I mean, if you're underage, yes, then you're a victim. If you're not underage, then you're not. Anyway, Anne Marie says from the NZZ, the Neue Zürcher Zeitung newspaper, says the Swiss mission in Brussels knew that the EU would place Swiss citizen Jacques Baud on the sanctions list. However, it did not warn him and did not contact him for 10 days. The EU did not consult Switzerland before deciding on the sanctions. That's very interesting. It's interesting that the Swiss mission would not have. I mean, that's really disgraceful. Because if they knew that a Swiss citizen who's not a member of the EU, he's not the citizen of any country in the EU. So they knew this, and they didn't warn him. Then that's pretty terrible, because sanctions, they can have very adverse consequences. I mean, if they hit your bank account, you suddenly are unable to use your money. You're unable to use your credit cards. You're unable to get on a plane. Then those are serious. Those are serious sanctions. And I don't know whether he'll be able to visit any EU countries or whatever. So sanctions can be extremely serious. Um, um, uh, so yeah, that I mean, but it's I think it's quite shocking the Swiss mission didn't warn him, because I think they should have warned him and allowed him to make preparations. Because why would the Swiss mission do anything at all to facilitate the work of Brussels? Their responsibility should be to a Swiss citizen, and to allow him to make due preparations, such as make sure that he still has access to his bank account, and everything else. Um, so that is quite upsetting. Um, Anyway, Schlumbucket Returns says what is really unseemly is that many of these rich people continue to associate with Epstein even after he was convicted for trafficking. Then there is the Laura Silsby sage with the Clinton. Um, I guess so. The the thing was that if they looked at the case, and I don't know whether how much they knew about the case, because people just aren't really that interested. I mean, ultimately he wasn't punished particularly severely, and I don't know whether they really examined the case. Who knows how much they knew about what actually happened in Florida, but you know, Florida just happened to have the age of consent in Florida just happens to be quite high. And as I said many times before, the age of consent in most countries in Europe is much lower than the age of consent in Florida. In Europe, 14 or 15 is the age of consent, in which case all of the women uh, that Jeffrey Epstein had sort of massages, some kind of sexual relations with, were all above that age. They're all above 14 or 15. I mean, but that's just a by the by. So just trying to explain why they hung out with Epstein. But there's also the other aspect to it, I think, which is what Chomsky mentioned, is that, well, under the legal system that we live under, once you've been convicted and you've been punished, then that's it. You've discharged your obligations to society, and you should be able to get on with your life. And as far as they were concerned, well, all right, he had a legal procedure, unlike Jacques Baud. So Jacques Baud never got a legal procedure, but Jeffrey Epstein did go through a legal procedure, and he received his punishment. But once the punishment was over, then essentially he has discharged his obligations to society, and he should be able to go back to a normal life. I mean, that's the way it's supposed to work. I mean, you're not supposed to just basically carry a red letter for the rest of your days. You've done it. It's the legal process is over. You've been punished. Now you should be able to get on with your life. That's really the theory of punishment. And there's no evidence, incidentally, that after that the Florida case was concluded, whenever it was 2008, 2009, that he ever had sexual relations with underage women. I'm not sure that there was ever that he ever did anything like that after 2008, 2009. So I think that's the way that these people were probably thinking. But when you think of Roman Polanski, what he did was far, far worse than anything Jeffrey Epstein did. And Roman Polanski, carried on making films, hanging out with celebrities. Admittedly, he couldn't come to the United States, but in Europe and he'd make films, go to parties, and no one held it against him what actually happened in his case back in Los Angeles. And so Jeffrey Epstein didn't do anything as as shocking as what Roman Polanski did. So, you know, and yet people continue to befriend Polanski. They showered him with honors. You know, Hollywood gave him an Oscar for what some crappy film. You know, so anyway, um, so yeah. But I think if they probably, the people that he hung out with, they probably didn't know much about the Florida case. They probably weren't that interested. But well, they saw that really it was over. He got a tap on the wrist, and you know, and then that's it. You know, as I said, you know, he should be able to get on with his life. I think that was probably their attitude. But not everyone did hang out with him. Bill Clinton didn't. So you know, we can. You know, I'm not a fan of Bill Clinton, but Bill Clinton did not hang out with Epstein after that. After the conclusion of that Florida case. Um, so anyway, I think you know it's getting quite late now. So thank you very much, everybody who joined me. Thank you so much for all of your questions and comments and thoughts. Thank you above all to those who contributed to the tip jar. You know, it's going to keep Buddy. Um, uh, you know, maybe keep him going for a couple of days. So Thursday is Christmas Day. I think we'll give it a rest. We won't have a live stream on Thursday. So happy Christmas, everybody. Enjoy, the Christmas Day. And then we'll be back. You know, this weekend we'll do some podcasts over the weekend, and then next Monday we're going to do the joint live stream with Peter, and then next Tuesday I'll be back with another live stream, solo live stream at the usual time. And thank you everybody for this year. Thank you those who contributed and continue to contribute to the tip jar. Thank you for all those who contributed to the Gaggle locals board. All this really interesting comments, all the interesting thoughts and memes, and it was always great. And people contributing their thoughts, ideas, musical ideas, film ideas, as always adds to the great community that we've built up here. So, Merry Christmas. Enjoy Thursday. See you very soon. All the best. Good night. Bye bye.